All right. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. My name is Rob Strait. I'm a partner with Moss Adams in our communications and media practice. And joining me today are two of the industry's regulatory heavyweights. I have Derrick Owens and Josh Seidemann. Derrick Owens is the Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs with WTA, and Josh Seidemann is the Vice President of Policy and Industry Innovation. Did I get that right, Josh? All right. And both of these organizations, WTA and NTTA, they are national organizations that focus on broadband regulation, representing thousands of members across the country, and many of which the NTTA members today are members of both these organizations as well. And I'll just throw a quick clip in that WTA is having their spring conference next week in San Antonio. So if you're not signed up, you might want to look into it because they put on an outstanding program and it's in an outstanding place to go to in April. So consider that and still have open availability as well. All right, so today I'm going to be asking Derrick and Josh a variety of questions on what the hot topics are and going on in federal regulation today. So jumping right in, Derrick and Josh, you both spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, lobbying before the FCC and Congress. Derrick, can you give us just set the scene, kind of give us a highlight of what's going on Capitol Hill today?
Yes. Can you guys, is this mic? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Rob. And good morning again, everybody. And no, I was up here yesterday, so you're probably tired of seeing my face, but please bear with us. Yeah, the political scene in Washington, D.C. right now is very tenuous at best. Congress really isn't legislating, but there's a lot of issues such as ACP that needs to be funded, which is stuck at the moment. So from a political standpoint, it's an election year, so everything is politics right now. And so that's what we have to contend with when we're looking at trying to get any major legislation that we need to have passed. Most of the real work is, quite honestly, is happening at the agency level, so at the FCC. And you heard Andy talk about, what RUS is doing from a funding standpoint on the broadband front. But, there's a number of pieces of legislation that we're trying to move, such as taxation of broadband grants. We've been working with a number of offices, both in the House and Senate, to try to get legislation passed that would essentially exempt broadband grants from being taxed at upwards of 20 some odd percent. But that's stalled. ACP, like I mentioned, there's an effort that's going to happen this week that in the House of Representatives, one of the members is going to file a discharge petition, which, is a technical term in legislators speak that once you get over a certain number of members co-sponsoring legislation, you can bypass sort of regular order, if you will, of going through the committees and all of that to get your legislation passed or at least considered on the House floor. And that would fund ACP at $7 billion, which is what the administration's request has been, as well as what the FCC says they need. Unfortunately, again, Congress isn't legislating at the moment, unfortunately, and they only have probably close to 40 some odd legislative days left between now and the election. So that's sort of where we're stuck at the moment, and just trying to figure out how do we get these things that we really need to have addressed right now taken care of. And like I said, most of the activity is really happening at the regulatory agencies.
All right, thanks. Josh, as Derrick mentioned, it's an election year. Do you have any preliminary predictions and or how this would impact regulation going forward?
Even if I did,
you wouldn't say.
I wouldn't say. But as Derrick mentioned, there's always something going on up on Capitol Hill. In addition to everything that Derrick mentioned, there's 140 pages of privacy legislation that was just dropped. And, on the one hand, it captures the broadband universe because it does away with the common carrier exemption, except now broadband providers are common carriers under the FCC's net neutrality order. the draft order that we expect to be voted in on April 25th. But there's a small business exemption, so it's just trying to figure out where that statute is going to land and how it's going to affect our block. There's a rip and replace bill up with $3 billion. So for new providers, it's nothing to worry about, but for older providers that might have Chinese equipment in their network, this could be very helpful in order to replace that equipment. And then there's a bipartisan work group working on USF, and Senator Cruz threw down a marker suggesting that rural healthcare, Lifeline, and schools and libraries be taken out of USF contributions and put into annual appropriations. And based on what's going on with ACP, how's that going for you? That could be have an adverse impact on those programs. But then high cost support, he said, everything's fine. We don't really need to worry about broadening the contribution base, and that we'll get into that conversation later, I'm sure, in our time up here this morning.
Can I just add one more thing, because I do think this is important to note. There may be another attempt to replace the speaker in the House of Representatives very soon. If that happens, again, everything will definitely come to a complete stop from a legislating standpoint. Everything that Josh just mentioned are things that, we need to have worked on. So be on the lookout for that over the next couple of weeks. It's very, very imminent, unfortunately. And I think the thought is the Democrats will be the ones who actually come in and save Speaker Johnson from actually vacating the speakership.
Which is, and I've got to stop talking because we can keep moving. But again, that's one of the reasons why there is a benefit very often to having things at the agency level and not subject to the vicissitudes that can permeate Congress. Your phone or mine?
No, but it wasn't mine. But I'm turning.
Next slide, please. Next slide. All right. One more, please. We're going to talk about the broadband data collection. So the broadband data collection, it's a relatively new requirement for carriers, and all carriers, whether big or small, they're required to report by location and by number the broadband serviceable locations in their area. And then they are also required to report on the broadband availability for each of those locations. And then consumers and carriers are then allowed the opportunity to challenge this data. Josh, can you speak to some of the problems that companies are experiencing with the broadband data collection and the location and availability data?
So, everything is in context. We're light years ahead of where we were back in the old days, because back in the old days, if there was a single location in a census block that was served, that entire census block would be categorized as served by the FCC. So we're doing much better. But there's still a lot of work to be done. The challenge process is tedious. It is labor intensive. One of the things that we've noticed is that we really want to be able to understand that for every location, the provider is actually able to satisfy three elements. Number one, that they're using their own facilities to get broadband out to that location, that with their own facilities, they're getting broadband out to that benchmark speed, and that they're not taking any high-cost universal service support in order to get the service there. What we're finding with certain providers, and this really exists primarily in the fixed wireless space, is really ascertaining that those locations are being served. There are some fixed wireless providers that are being extraordinarily generous in their projections of where they serve, and the data that we would want to be able to examine to verify that those locations are being served just isn't there. It's a very broad, we ran a propagation model and we extrapolated the data, and we can serve these hundreds of thousands of locations across these states. But again, it's important, as we know, it's important to be able to verify that that service is actually there. And if it's not there, that's an opportunity for companies to come in and say, hey, we can use a fiber-based solution to get there.
All right, thank you. And the broadband data collection, it's also a vital component when identifying the locations that are eligible for some of the various funding programs, such as BEAD and Reconnect program. Derrick, why is this so important for companies to have this broadband data collection data, and what are some of the concerns that companies are having with it and identifying those locations?
Yeah, I think, Josh touched on many of those. It's making sure that, one, you know where service is and where it isn't, so that you can apply for funding where there is no service, but also to prevent somebody from actually overbuilding you because the data may not have shown up on the map as being, a location that's served or an area that is actually served. So, it's sort of a double-edged sword. We hear members all the time talk about, this is really a tedious process, but it really is in your best interest as a carrier and a provider to make sure you complete those steps to make sure you don't get overbilled, because, whether you're using your own money or government money to build the network, you want to make sure that you're not being overbuilt and the resources that you actually had could have gone someplace else potentially. So those are some of the big issues.
Thank you. Yeah. And there also just seems to be a never-ending flow of regulation, right? That's coming out. And many are referring to this as the regulatory creep. And one of those, I'm going to speak to a few of those items, but let's start with net neutrality, Josh. Can you just share what is net neutrality? What does this mean to the companies out here?
So net neutrality is the notion that end users should be able to access any type of content that they want, that the broadband internet companies shouldn't play favorites, that they shouldn't throttle some traffic but let another one to come in. And our pitch to the FCC throughout all these cycles of net neutrality, because the FCC issued a net neutrality order in 2015, and then the PI Commission overturned it, and then we knew that the Rosen-Orsel Commission, as soon as they got a majority of the Democratic Party, would then put the item back on the agenda and vote it in, and the draft order is out, and we're expecting that to be voted in, as I mentioned, on April 25th. Our position to the FCC throughout this is that the end user marketplace for broadband internet access service is healthy, and there was no need to impose any regulation on it. I think often you can take a look at what the investment houses are saying. When the notice of proposed rulemaking first was trotted out in October and November this past year, one of the investment houses told the industry, don't worry about it, it's going to get overturned in court, even if the commission votes it in. As recently as a couple of weeks ago, there was another major investment house that told the industry, don't worry about it, it's not really going to change your day-to-day business. The major issue, and the FCC has said that they are not going to impose rate regulation on the internet market, and they're going to stand down from imposing some of the more onerous regulations, but it does implicate the possibility of some pretty heavy-duty privacy regulations. There is regulatory overhang, because even if the FCC says we won't, it doesn't mean that we can't. I think the biggest issue that we saw, and that we're pushing back against in the net neutrality order, is that, as you know, the Universal Service Fund is funded with an assessment on revenues of telecommunications carriers, and those interstate telecommunication revenues have been decreasing over time, so the contribution burden increases in order to keep the funding level up. The FCC could have used this reclassification to say, all right, listen, now ISPs are telecommunications carriers, and now they should be contributing as well. And if you have more people contributing to a bucket, it means that each person's contribution is smaller. Because if I look at this side of the room and say, hey, I need to raise $2,000 by the end of the session, you're all on the hook. But if I say, hey, I need to raise $2,000 from the entire room, we can do it, and everyone has to contribute a little bit less per person. The FCC said we're not, even though we're going to reclassify ISPs as being technically on the hook to contribute to USF, we're going to forbear, we're not going to make them contribute. And that's probably one of the biggest, I think, missed opportunities. This was a very easy way to take some of the pressure off of USF contributions.
Well, and I would just add to that, the FCC is looking at this from the standpoint, well, Congress is working on, through the working group, maybe addressing this issue in the contribution base. As I mentioned earlier, Congress isn't doing anything and probably won't do anything in the near future on this. And so I agree with Josh that this was and is a missed opportunity to expand the base of contributors, to bring in those who are actually causing a lot of the increase in the network bandwidth that's required to actually start contributing as well. Congress needs to legislate on that to give the FCC the authority. But as far as ISPs contributing, the FCC, in my mind, it's a no-brainer. They should have done this, and they should do this before they actually vote at the end of this month. It will be a missed opportunity that's going to take even much longer. The contribution factor right now, for those of you in the room who are providers, is 34%. Down slightly from last quarter, but at some point, when is the contributions factor too high for policymakers and regulators to say enough is enough? We have to do something. We thought 10 years ago,
20%,
it was 15%. And then 3 years after that, it was 20%. It's 34% right now. Do we have to get to 50%? I don't know. But, this is, if you're talking about equity among everybody contributing, it seems, this is the way you should be going.
Yes, it's very inequitable today and just continues to keep getting pushed and pushed. No one wants that political football, I guess.
Well, I want to get into the conversation here because this is stuff I like. I mean, I like advocating. I like to go to DC, talk to these guys. These guys are heavyweight lobbyists, but I'm a lightweight lobbyist for NTTA. But as part of the mix, we're going to have a bunch of new companies coming online here, tribal nations that will have ISPs. And some of you will be and could be providers also. So where does that lay you guys out here in this regulatory field that they're talking about? Some of you might go under some form of regulation like this is. You have to comply with it, or you could be fined. And you don't even know all these things yet, but you will have to learn this stuff. So let's look at two things. ACP's gone. So what do tribes have to go after to get more funding? The only thing that's left is called Lifeline. Lifeline gives you $34.25 for tribes, for consumers that need help in getting funding like ACP did. So ACP's gone. You were getting $75 before, but that's gone. So now it's $34.25. So how do you get that? And what's the hurdles to do that? Getting ETC is going to be tough for a lot of tribes to get. Whether they go through the state, we had this kind of conversation yesterday, or to go through directly to the FCC. How do we make that easier? We need to start advocating. We need to start talking to Congress, talking to the FCC, talking to people you gave us all this money for infrastructure, but it has nothing to do with the startup funding when you start up the company and the monthly operational costs. Those are two important things that you have to learn what that cost is going to be, your numbers, in order to be able to operate your company. Or if not, then it's going to be a different operation of the tribe where the tribe will have to give money just to make it run. And you don't know what that's going to be. So it might be some cost that's going. So we need to look at advocating for ETC. It's been a long time since we have maybe 100 new companies coming online to get in line for ETC. So can you guys give us a little bit of insight of what that process could be and how could the associations help to make that a lot easier? Do we need to open a docket at the FCC? Do we need to do something to be able to make this happen easier for tribes?
So I think there is certainly room to meet with the FCC in the coming months, in the coming year, and meet with the Wireline Bureau and figure out a way to create some sort of a structure where that process for ETC designation will be easier for the tribes. And that could be, I don't know whether that's a dedicated channel. And again, keeping in mind all of the different variables that come into getting service on a tribal land in terms of a NEPA process, in terms of environmental assessments, taking a look at why these companies are going to why these companies will face different situations than just, say, a company that's going to get on to an ECT designation in Alabama or Indiana. So I do think opening it up with a conversation with the Wireline Bureau, getting ONAP involved as well.
Say that, yep.
Yeah, and I think, again, these offices exist at the FCC. Let's find a way to bring them together. Let's find a way to start that dialogue.
I think it's good, Josh, you just mentioned ONAP, because I'm not sure if Bambi is still here, but there you are, right there.
There you are.
Right in the front. But yeah, I mean, Bambi can take this back to the FCC and start having those conversations internally, and then we continue to backfill on that as well to support that effort. But I do think it needs to be a concerted effort in order, whether it's a streamlined process or some other process by which, ETC designation happens for tribal entities.
And I think that's where, again, it's a terrific industry, and for every entrant that's walking in fresh and new, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other companies that have gone down this road before. And I think that getting the associations and working with the management consulting firms and the engineering firms, that we can identify what are the core common issues that may come into play for many of these companies, and then to work with ONAP and the Wireline Bureau to say, okay, listen, how can we preempt a problem before it becomes a big problem?
Exactly.
What can we be on the lookout for?
Godfrey, you talk about the process and the time and energy it takes. Some of that is by design, but it shouldn't be overly, time consuming. Part of the issue is you want to make sure that, you're not just granting ETC designations to grant ETCs, because, there's going to be some, there's $65 total billion that's out there for broadband. There's going to be some companies who decide, yeah, we want to get into this business because there's a lot of money, but then they realize, oh, we can't do this. We didn't really want to do this, but we like the money. And so it's making sure that you go through the process, that you're going to be a legitimate carrier, meeting all the criteria and expectations of being a carrier in the community. And so that's the reason why these processes take a long time. But I think there's agreement. It shouldn't take and shouldn't be so overly burdensome and time consuming that, legitimate companies say, we're done. We can't do this any longer because we're not getting decisions made.
And you bring up some good points, especially for tribes that are trying to start their companies here soon. They're going to be looking at, how do I sustain this company? How do I keep it running? How do I do that? Well, there's a fund there called USF that telecoms actually pull funding out of to be able to do that. They follow a lot of regulations to do that. I mean, it's like 700 man hours of reports that I do every year just to be part of that. So if these companies need that kind of help, since most tribes are not like here, next to Phoenix or something like that, most tribes are way out in the middle of nowhere. We heard that from Administrator Burke a while ago, where he was riding around somewhere near the border and he said, didn't know, hopefully he made it back. So, most of these areas, most reservations are in the most rural parts of the country. So we need help to be able to get that. So how do we become part of that pool of funding that's out there to be able, and the USFS does have $9 billion in it per year. So how do we pull money out of that and become part of that? So to become an ETC for the purpose of receiving subsidies, it's a process. It might not be the same animal as regular telecoms because we have a voice component that we provide, 911 services, all these kind of things. Maybe you don't want to just provide ISP services where it's just internet services. The regulatory side of this is very complicated, but we're NTTA is here to help you with that. And I'm advocating for that when I go to DC. We're talking about these issues, but I like to see if hopefully we're all on the right track, because you guys have good insight of what's happening, what's the buzz, and how can we get into that pool? Would it be tough, or would the industry let us do that? Because most of other telcos said, well, we're barely getting enough, so we don't want you to take any more of our share. But, you know, we need to carve a share aside just for tribal ISPs. You know, that could be another way of doing that. But I wanted to make sure we started that conversation today to be able to start doing that, because we're about maybe a year to a year and a half when these new companies come online. They're going to need some kind of support system to be able to maintain and provide the services that tribes are looking for. So you guys got to start thinking about this stuff, because this is coming real quick on how to do this. All right. So questions for you guys. I'd like to hear some comments on that.
I was just going to just add that within universal service, there are the 4 programs. You mentioned the high cost program, which is where telecom providers get their support. We all pay into universal services, Josh mentioned, on, you know, our telephone bills or whatever we call them these days. But the other programs are, you talked about Lifeline for low income folks. There's a discussion that maybe ACP gets wrapped into Lifeline. We've been pushing for that if, you know, Congress doesn't fund any ACP dollars to keep the program going through the end of this year, to allow the USF Working Group and others to come up with a longer term solution for ACP. The belief is it will be merged into Lifeline. So you mentioned the 34.95 or 25 for Lifeline. If ACP and Lifeline get merged together, I think that's going to be another opportunity for you to actually probably get closer to the $75 that you're getting right now through ACP if those programs get merged. Then you have rural healthcare as a third program, which helps connect rural healthcare facilities to telecom services at discount. And then you also have the E-rate program, the schools and libraries. And, you know, I think it was talked about yesterday about the tribal library broadband provision within the rulemaking that's been underway at the FCC for some time. So those are the 4 programs that we're talking about when we talk about universal service. And you would essentially be getting money through the high cost portion, although the FCC is in the process. Well, you have model-based support that's now been extended for some carriers through 2038. You have carriers who are considered what we call legacy telecom or CAF BLS providers. Their funding stream doesn't have a time frame associated with it, so it's a yearly thing essentially. And then you have Alaska Plan and others within the support mechanisms within the high cost portion. So maybe it is creating some sort of tribal carve out that's dedicated money for that, for sustainability. I do agree. Maybe we should be having those conversations with the commission to sort of figure out, what are you thinking about in this regard? Because the pot of money is very narrowly defined. But again, if we were able to get contributions reformed, that could be another way in which we can bring more money into the pool or into the pot, if you will, that then could be expanded to cover tribal entities who are becoming broadband providers.
Right. I mean, Derrick mentioned before that the contribution rate is now about 34.5%. There was an effort undertaken by 4 parties that don't always work together in DC, but they got together on contributions. They did a study and found that if the contribution rate was then shifted just from telecom to include broadband revenues as well, that contribution rate would plummet to about 3.5% per person, per account. It is an incredibly exciting time, and I think this is why we can, take advantage of the momentum. I mean, there's an awful lot of funding out there for tribal entities to take advantage of. The technology is just galloping in terms of how we can use this broadband-enabled technology for everything from agriculture and economic development to healthcare that can really help improve all of our communities. And there's this sweet moment on Capitol Hill and within the agencies where they're not just recognizing that, but they're embracing it. And for better or for worse, COVID was that inflection point where we really saw as a nation the power of broadband to improve healthcare and work opportunities and economic development. And if we can work together to bring that to everyone, I think we'll have done our job.
And Godfrey, I just want to point out, just so the tribes understand, you mentioned earlier, well, becoming an ETC, whether you provide broadband or voice, and that would be one hurdle that would have to be overcome today, is today to be an ETC, you need to offer voice-related services. So it may enhance the argument for a tribal broadband separate process, becoming an ETC without providing voice services, but as a broadband provider, so that they're not held to all of those onerous standards that come with being a voice provider.
That'd be great, because like I said, again, baby's coming. I mean, baby's going to be born. You got to put him in a house that's going to be able to feed it, take care of it, make sure it's warm, all these kind of things. Baby's coming. So we've got to be able to figure out how a lot of this sustainability factor funding is in our plans for providing the business that we need. I mean, you guys, I don't know if you guys, it's been all the hype about building the network. We've got all the money for that. But now it's going to come time to look at the operations of the network. Who's going to pay for that? Where's that funding going to come from? Do you have enough customers to be able to provide a base amount of funding coming every month? These are the sustainability factors that you guys need to start asking the hard questions of yourself, of with your tribal government, that they know that this is coming. So I want to make sure that everybody knows that. And these are very important issues. But this is what I really like. I mean, this advocacy part of this, running this, going to DC, talking, getting conversations started. And these guys help so much. I mean, it's my charge in life to be able to do this for any country. And like I said, this is kind of more my passion. So I really like, and I like talking to these guys because they let me know what's going on and what's going on at Hill. So I've got to wrap this up. I know we've gone a little long, but I really appreciate this conversation. And we're going to do more of this because, again, I've got to get answers for any country to be able to figure out how this is going to be sustained. Like I said, we got all the money for the fiber, the equipment, everything to be installed. But when we start day one, do we have enough customers to help pay for the network? If not, then where do I get extra money? Is that going to come from the tribe? Do I try to start looking for funding from the government? What's that going to be? So those are the questions that we're looking at, and NTTA is doing that. So eventually we're going to start asking, please join NTTA in membership so you can be part of the conversation to understand a lot of these things that are going on. So, and I'm not really pushing that very hard yet, but NTTA membership is going to be crucial to help build this advocacy portion for tribal America. All right. So, hey, I want to thank you guys so much for that. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Derrick. Thank you, Rob. I mean, this was a great conversation.